Professor Raghavendra Gadagkar, the Indian Institute of Science, Bengaluru, who will be speaking today on the subject of war and peace, conflict and cooperation in an insect society. Professor Gadagkar is presently professor at the Center for Ecological Sciences and at the Center for Contemporary Studies in the Indian Institute of Science, Bengaluru. He has been president of the Indian National Science Academy, New Delhi. He did his master's and prior to that his BSc at Bengaluru University and his doctorate in molecular biology from the Indian Institute of Science. He has not only published over 250 papers, but is the author of Survival Strategies, published in 1997, and The Social Biology of Ropalidia, 2001. I won't further stand between you and our very distinguished speaker, so without further ado, Professor Gadagkar.
An honor to be here and to have the opportunity to speak to this audience. I do want to begin with a little story. Many years ago, we invited Mahesh Rangarajan to give a lecture at the Center for Ecological Sciences, Indian Science, Bangalore. And scientists do not sit and speak, they stand and speak. And so there was no chair for him to sit. And we introduced him and we said, please begin. And he was sort of looking around, and then I asked him, what do you want? He said, I want a chair. I said, a chair, sure. So we brought a chair, he sat down and he spoke. And when I came here, I looked around and I said, where am I going to speak? They said, here. I said, no. Then they brought me a podium. So now the deal is complete. In fact, Mahesh might or might not know, I have written a paper on why some people stand and speak and why some people sit and speak. It's a pleasure to be here. I've called this War and Peace, Conflict and Cooperation in Insect Society. I have many agendas today to carry out through this talk and through this title. I and my students work on insects, and we are particularly interested in insects that live in social groups. At some level, you can call us insect sociologists. We're interested in how and why insects live in groups. You may not appreciate the importance of the why question, but I'm sure you'll appreciate the question of how question. Because when you live in groups, there are many problems that you have to solve, and little insects with little brains, how do they solve these problems, is of obvious interest. It may not be so obvious to you that there's a fundamental why question. And that is because, unlike humans living in groups, when insects such as ants, bees, and wasps live in groups, their group structure is so, in some sense, hierarchical that only one or a small number of individuals actually get to reproduce and have children. And the rest are so busy working to make it possible for these few to have families that they don't get any opportunity to have children of their own. This, of course, is a Darwinian paradox. How does natural selection, evolution by natural selection, permit such individuals to persist for millions of years, those who sacrifice their own reproduction simply to help someone else? So, social insects provide a fundamental paradox for Darwinian theory of natural selection, which was articulated first by none other than Darwin. And he even said, at first I thought this will annihilate my whole theory. And he tried to produce some explanation making this peculiar altruistic behavior consistent with his theory. But I can confess that till today we haven't solved the problem. It still is an ongoing problem. We have realized after many years of working on the why question that we can't really make much more headway with the why question until we answer some of the how questions. How they live in groups is intimately linked to why they might live in groups. So in my research group, we try to address the why and the how questions sort of parallelly, simultaneously. The why questions feed into the how questions and how into the why questions. Today I will talk mainly about the how questions. Before I actually go to the questions, let me give a brief introduction to the world of insect societies, if you permit me to call them. This itself is an insect society. This is a wasp, which is very common in southern India. And I have spent most of my life watching this wasp, I would really say. The operative word is watching. Studying comes later. If you don't watch, you don't study. But let me begin with something which is more familiar to everybody else, everybody here, and that is the archetypal insect society, which is the honeybee. As you would all know, honeybees live in colonies. The colonies consist of large number of individuals, sometimes 50, 60,000 individuals. And in these individuals, so this is, for example, a picture of a honeybee colony. This, in fact, is the smallest honeybee in the world. This is called Apis florea, or the Asian dwarf bee. It's only found in Asia. And amongst the bees, both in terms of body size and in terms of colony size, it's perhaps the smallest of the species. In a bee colony, if you look at the bees carefully, you will always find that there is only one queen, one single large fertile female bee, which we call the queen bee. You will find a small number of male bees, which are called drones. The most obvious characteristic of the drones is that they are lazy, as the phrase goes. They are lazy, they do not do any work. They basically mature, mate, transfer their sperm to future queens from other colonies, and they die. But they live on these colonies. So the fact that they live on these colonies, get all their benefits of living in the colonies, and do not contribute to labor is in some ways striking. This is, of course, a major question. And in fact, one of my students addressed this question, answered this question as to why they don't work. And you will have to believe me, because I won't have time to talk about that. She actually, because she understood why they don't work, she got them to actually work. That's what I mean by the how questions allow you to answer the why questions. And the why questions allow you to. So she proposed a theory as to why they don't work. And she said that theory can only be proved if I actually get them to work. And she got them to work, by the way. So sometimes they work. And it might amuse you to know that we wrote a paper saying males work given an opportunity. And what she showed is that they actually aren't given an opportunity. I don't know how true this is of human species, but certainly with the wasps, it is true. Apart from the drones and the queens, the rest of the colony consists of these little tiny sterile, nearly sterile female bees who are so-called worker bees, and they do all the work that is required. The queen doesn't. The queen does two things. She lays eggs. She eats food, converts food into eggs, and she can lay thousands of eggs per day. Imagine if you are to maintain a population of 60,000 workers who all have a lifespan of about 6 weeks, you have to produce lots of eggs per day. And that's what she does. So she's an egg-producing machine. But she also does something less tangible. She synthesizes through her body's metabolic machinery a number of different chemical substances and releases them outside the body. And these chemical substances help to regulate the activity, the well-orchestrated coordinated activity that is required to run a society. These chemicals play a very important role. Not in terms of directing individuals, but in terms of regulating. So she does only these two things. Now there's a lot of work to be done, and the workers do this work, and they organize themselves in doing this in a rather interesting way. What a bee will do today depends on its age. Not on its absolute age, but on its relative age. If I'm the youngest member of the colony, this is my job. If I'm the oldest member of the colony, that's my job. If I'm a middle-aged bee, this is my job. And this is not divided just into 3 parts, but into about a dozen different age groups. So a new bee, as soon as she is born, so to speak, becomes an adult from a pupa, her first job is she cleans. She's a cleaner. She begins by cleaning the cell from which she came out and cleans the surroundings. So that's all she's capable of doing in the first 1 or 2 days of her life. In a few days, little glands in her body will develop through which she can make wax. And wax is required to build the nest, because the nest is made from wax. So she becomes a builder because now she has wax. A few days later, other glands in her mouth will mature, which will produce chemicals which are needed for the growth of the larvae. You have to add these chemicals to the food of the larvae, so now she becomes a nurse bee. She feeds the larvae. A little later, she will move about and start processing food. She may mature into an undertaker and remove dead bodies of bees. Then she becomes a guard bee. All of this she does in a sequential manner for the first half of her life at home, and the second half of her life she goes out in search of pollen and nectar. And she then brings them back, and as many of you would know, bees have evolved a dance language through which a bee which has found a large amount of food can come back and recruit naive bees, basically send them, not take them, send them to that particular place by telling them through a dance about what she has found, how much she has found, how far away, and in what direction to get there. All of this is conveyed through a dance language, and the bees go there. So all of this work is done by the workers. Here you see a picture of a queen bee surrounded by a group of worker bees. If you spread the bees a little bit and actually watch the queen bee, you will always find that the queen is surrounded by a group of workers. We call this, in fact, the royal retinue. These workers are, if you like, on royal duty. Their job is to clean the queen, lick the queen, feed the queen. She has no time for any of these. She is so busy laying eggs that these have to be done to her. And as she moves from one part of the nest to the other laying eggs, this whole retinue moves along with her. They are like her personal attendants. But if you actually watch this, you will find something very perplexing. The bees do this so diligently, but a few minutes later they seem to lose interest in this, and they'll go off and do something else. And other bees will come and take their place. Indeed, this royal duty is done in short shifts of a few minutes at a time. And this has a huge consequence. It gives an opportunity for a very large fraction of the workforce to be in the physical vicinity of the queen and touch her and receive the chemicals she produces. So through this, the chemicals get spread in the colony very, very efficiently because of this turnover of the workers who actually take care of the queens. So there are infinite number of such interesting mechanisms which are seen in social insects. I can only whet your appetite with a few of these things. Here is a bee at a flower. Bees collect pollen as well as nectar, and if they take nectar, they store it in the crop where it is not digested until they deliver it home. But pollen they actually stuff in little things called pollen baskets on their hind legs. Then they go home and they deliver this. The source of protein for the bees comes from the pollen. The source of carbohydrate comes from the nectar. Here is a grand old zoologist, Carl von Frisch, an Austrian zoologist, who actually discovered the dance language that I spoke about a few minutes ago. He deciphered the dance language, and in fact he was given the Nobel Prize for this discovery in the year 1973 when I was a first-year master student, and that has sort of remained with me for a long time. Now, bees are not the only social insects. Ants are even better examples. Better for two reasons. One is there are about 10 species of honeybees in the world. There are 12 to 15,000 species of ants, and all of them are highly social. This is a very common ant in Asia, in India, in Delhi, in Bangalore. This is called the weaver ant. And it's called the weaver ant because it actually makes nests by stitching leaves together. On trees, live leaves which are still attached to the tree are brought together. Two leaves are brought together to align their surfaces, and you can see how many ants are needed to do that job. Large number of ants climb on one leaf, others on another leaf. They make bridges of ants, and then a few ants in the middle drop off, so the bridge becomes narrower and narrower until two leaves are aligned. And once the leaves are aligned, they actually stitch these leaves using silk fibers. Where do they get silk? Adult insects never make silk, but the larvae make silk. So once the leaves are aligned, one of the ants will go inside the nest, catch hold of a fully grown larva, bring her outside, squeeze her appropriately, and if you allow some anthropomorphism, persuade her to donate some silk for the community good. And that's how they stitch these leaves. Now, believe it or not, ants practice agriculture. If we want to single out one achievement of the human society which has resulted in all the rest of the achievements, I think it's the invention of agriculture. 15,000 years ago, something like that. Ants practice agriculture starting 50 million years ago. They do not grow flowering plants as we do, they grow fungi. And in much the same way that we do. And they cultivate these fungi, they go and collect leaves, which is a substratum on which they grow the fungi. And what they eat are not the leaves, they only eat their agricultural produce. A single colony may have up to 1 million individuals which have to be fed every day. And all of that comes from their agricultural produce. Imagine their problems with pests, imagine their problems with fertilizers, imagine their problem with loss of nutrients in the soil. They have solved all of these problems, and their agriculture is much, much more sustainable than ours, and it has lasted at least 50 million years ago. If it disappears, it will only be on account of us, not on account of them. That brings me to another group of insects. My favorite, these are wasps. Most wasps, what biologists call wasps, are not social. They are either solitary or they are parasitic. A small number, which means a few hundred species, maybe 1,000 species, are social. All social wasps are called paper wasps. And the reason why they are called paper wasps is they build their nest not from wax as honeybees do, not from leaves as ants do, not with soil as termites do, but with paper. Where do they get paper from? They manufacture paper. How do they manufacture paper? In exactly the same way that we manufacture paper. They scrape cellulose fibers from plants, chew it up, add various chemicals, make it into a fine pulp, spread it into a thin layer and dry it. That's how we make paper. And it is paper, you can write on it. And all social wasps make their nest from paper. Here is a nest of one of the largest ones. Here what this wasp has done, it has covered its entire nest with a paper envelope, leaving only a small opening for the wasp to fly in and out. If you remove this outer envelope, what you will see is what I like to call a multi-storied apartment complex. So you have these various layers of comb, all made of paper, in which they rear their young ones. Honeybees use their nests not only to rear the young ones, but also to store food. Wasps use their nests only to rear young ones, not to store food, because wasps are entirely non-vegetarian. And they have not invented a refrigerator, so they cannot store food. They have to find their food every day. Honeybees can store enough food to last for weeks, and therefore can survive even if there is no food. Wasps have to find their food on a daily basis. This is the wasp we work with. We work on this wasp rather than the previous one for obvious reasons. It's small, it's easy to handle, and they do not cover themselves with an envelope. So you can actually see everything here. All of this is visible to us. It's basically a two-dimensional nest. It's not even a sphere. And you see here, these are the adults. There are larvae, there are pupae, and this is what we study. This is the insect society that we have studied. I will change gears now and introduce certain themes which are all part of my agenda. The question is, as human beings, is it at all possible in principle that we can actually claim to understand an insect society? And I think we should take this question seriously, because it is a real question. Can we at all claim? And we should be concerned about this question when we actually study. So what I want to do today is to tell you what we think we have understood, and I'll give you the evidence on the basis of which we think so, and I really want to let you decide whether you can call this understanding or not. I would love to know what the wasps think, but I don't know how to ask them. But I'd love to know what you think. Maybe you think we haven't understood that. But that answer to this question, I really want to leave to you. But as I said, since I want all of us, including me and my students, to take this question seriously, I'll spend a couple of more minutes on this. I'm very fond of this quotation by Heraclitus, which said, "Nature loves to hide." So let's not be so overconfident that you look at nature and you understand it. I am even more fond of another quotation by another philosopher, Sir Francis Bacon, who said nature does not unveil its secrets except under the torture of experiments. I introduce this to my students and I say there is a challenge before you. Do not think that you look at something and you have understood it. You are fighting against all the odds, and therefore you must make that much effort to see whether you really can. Now, very briefly, many people ask me, how do you study them? Because it's very perplexing to the layman. How can you study? How can you do anything with these things? And I'll be very brief. The first important thing, as I said already, these are openness, easy to observe, two-dimensional, so you can see everything. We have developed a method of uniquely marking with little spots of colored paint every individual wasp. We mark it as soon as it's born. It has a specific kind of color code. It has a name, and these colors remain for life. And this then, a file is opened in our computer for each wasp, and we enter information about this wasp for as long as it's alive. So we have files, dossiers on thousands and thousands of wasps in our computer where we can enter. That's one of the important equations. Secondly, we are able to study them where they are. I'm sure there are wasps which are sort of cousins of these are all around this building. Wherever they are, we go and study them. But we can also bring them to our laboratory and we can transplant them to our laboratory. Our laboratory is not a typical laboratory with closed doors. In fact, our laboratory has no walls. It only has a wire mesh surrounding. Because all we do is we transplant these wasps at night and then we say, you're free to do what you want. And they go out, bring food. They may leave, they may bring somebody else. They're completely natural except that now their location is closer to us so that we can watch them. And if we need, for certain kinds of experiments, we can put them in various kinds of cages which we have designed, but the rest are free to go in and out. We can stack lots of these cages in one room. Even if there are two nests are only a few centimeters apart, they will find their way about. We don't have to do anything. If you want to keep them close, then only we feed them, otherwise we don't even have to. So that's a little bit of how we study them. But the more difficult question when people ask me, why do you study them in the first place? Necessarily is it worth doing? And my answer is the following. Why do you study social wasps? People often ask me. For the same reason that an anthropologist studies humans, is my answer. That's really my goal. Anthropologists can offer us a glimpse into the lives and mores of primitive, exotic, different kinds of human societies. But biologists can do, I think, much more. They can offer us insights from a whole range of animal societies with millions of years of evolutionary history. And those of us who study insects can hope to harness wisdom, and that's the operative word. Wisdom, not instruction. Wisdom from an altogether different sub-kingdom of life. It's very hard. So this is the species I work with, and the theme around which I want to weave a fraction of our research in this talk is around the balance between cooperation and conflict. One of the outcomes of our study is the realization that there is never pure conflict. If there is conflict, cooperation is not very far away. There is never pure cooperation. If there is cooperation, conflict is not very far away. All you have to do is to tweak just a little bit to jump from conflict to cooperation. At one level, this is frightening. At another level, it's extremely satisfying. Of course, if you are in the zone of cooperation, it's frightening that very quickly you can go into conflict. But if you're in the zone of conflict, which is where we most of the time are, it is heartening to know that you tweak something, conflict can be involved. So that's roughly the kind of thing I want to talk about. But there are other agendas in my talk. I believe that the process of doing science is as important, I would say more important than the product of science. And the mistake that scientists make is they're only concerned about the product. They communicate the product to students, they communicate the product to the public, and they create this boundary between I'm a scientist and you're a layman. And I think that is not the real thing. The important thing is the process by which the science is done. And that process has to be communicated, not only to the public, but even amongst ourselves. In fact, I would argue that only a small number of people might be interested in the products of my research. But many more people would be interested in the process of my research, because the process is more easily transferable from one discipline to the other. The products may be of interest only to a few people. The process is more important, and we seldom talk about the process. So throughout this talk, I'm going to give as much or more importance to the process as to the product. Now, research in our group will begin in roughly the following way. I have a bunch of students. At any given time, I have a fairly large number of students, all of them absolutely passionate about watching nature, and particularly about watching Ropalidia marginata, that's the name of it. So basically, our major job in life is to watch this wasp society, which is fascinating to watch. You can never get tired of watching. Especially if you have individual wasps marked and identified, then you begin to see their peculiarities and their personalities and their conflicts and their cooperation. Never boring. So that's our main job. Now, as we watch for pleasure, we begin to ask some questions in our mind. How can this be possible? Why did that thing happen? And then we discuss these questions and we pick a question which we think we might be able to answer. We might be able to begin to answer. And then we devise strategies of answering that question. This is of course a multi-layered process. You devise one strategy, maybe it doesn't work, you devise another strategy, it takes you one step further, you devise a strategy, and this can go on for a few years. At some point we say we have at least a partial tentative answer to this question. Now as soon as we reach that stage, almost invariably we have at least one new question which requires an answer, a question which did not exist earlier, which we could not even have asked earlier because we didn't know this fact. And then of course a few such questions arise, then we discuss and say, okay, this new question is possibly answerable, and we go through the whole process. And this is how it proceeds from question, from observation to question to answer to observation to question to answer. And since I said the process is as important as the product, the only way I'm going to give this lecture is I can take you through this process of making observation, of asking a question, of answering the question, and telling you what the new question is. So my lecture will be organized in this fashion. Of course, questions can be broken down into small or large, but even a reasonable sized breaking of the question would suggest that we have answered maybe 30, 40, 50 questions so far. I'll pick about 10 or so to give you a flavor of how this proceeds. And I picked these questions so as to be around this theme of conflict and cooperation. So questions and answers. Now, I also want to talk about war and peace, cooperation and conflict. So let me begin with stories of peace. I just inclined to begin with peace rather than with war. So let me begin with peace. Now, in the very beginning of our study, I watched these wasps, and the question I was interested in knowing is there's one queen. Now, one fact I have to tell you. In a honeybee colony, you look at the queen, you can identify her. She's a large, separate, specialized individual. In our wasp, you don't know who the queen is. Everybody looks identical. Everybody is physiologically identical. It's a much more democratic society, if you like. One of them becomes the queen, and only temporarily. She may be overthrown, and somebody else becomes the queen. Until you actually see her laying eggs, you will not know who the queen is. And she doesn't have the luxury of this royal retinue around her. So the question is, how do these wasps behave? What is the variation from one individual to the other? And how does the queen behave with respect to the others? And the way I tried to answer this question was I devised methods of calculating, quantitatively calculating, how much time each wasp spends in each behavior. So I simply watched them, and in plain English, in common sense terms, I made a list of the things that they do. Fairly arbitrary classification. They fly, they sit, they feed, they bite another wasp, they feed a larva, they clean the nest, they build the nest. So just in plain English made a list of about 100 different activities that the wasps do, and I devised a method of being able to calculate what proportion of its daylight hours each wasp spends in each of these behaviors. Now I had a huge data matrix, wasps' behaviors, and I subjected this data matrix to statistical analysis and tried to see if there's a pattern in this variation. And to our great surprise, we found that there's a rather distinct pattern. In fact, there are three kinds of wasps. We call them sitters, fighters, and foragers. The sitters are the wasps who seem to be rather lazy, do rather little. The fighters are wasps who are mostly on the nest, but they're aggressive, they're nasty, they bite each other, they chase each other, they fight with each other. And then there are the so-called foragers who are hard-working wasps who spend a lot of time outside the nest. They are the ones who go and bring food. So there are these three kinds of wasps. And when I did this analysis, I deliberately did not tell myself, this is the queen and I'm going to look at her separately. I said, if the queen doesn't look different from everybody else, who am I to treat her differently? So we collected this data, how each wasp distributes its time in each activity. For shorthand, we'll call it time activity budget. So the time activity budget of each wasp was fed into the computer without any information about who the queen is. And we got these three clusters, three groups. Now we can ask post facto, where is the queen in this scheme? Common sense told us that the queen will be a fighter. Because in the few other species of this kind that had been studied, especially in North America, it was a sort of rule that the queen rules by aggression. The queen uses physical aggression to run the society. She uses physical aggression to keep her workers under control, make sure that they do not become queens, and make sure they actually work. And so common sense suggested queens must be amongst the fighters. But to our great surprise, we found that the queens are not in the fighters. In fact, the queens are lazy sitters. Colony after colony, we found that queens are lazy sitters. And therefore, a question arose which could not have arisen earlier, namely, if the queen is such a meek sitter, how does she become a queen in the first place? If there's an aggressive individual biting and chasing and harassing everybody else, one can understand why they all accept her as the queen. But if there's a queen who is meek and docile, sitting in a corner, not even interacting with other individuals, why on earth would anybody accept her as the queen? So this is what I meant, a question that arises because you have an answer to the previous question. This question could have arisen earlier. And we said this question we can probably try to answer, but we remembered what Sir Francis Bacon said, that you have to do experiments. So we devised an experiment which can potentially answer this question. And the experiment was a very simple one. I always say that science begins with simplicity and common sense. Only if common sense is inadequate, you must add something else to it. We should not say, I'm a scientist, therefore common sense is not going to work for me. I'm going to work with formulae. Formulae come only if common sense doesn't work. We begin with common sense. We said, we want to know how does she become a queen in the first place? So we said, we must watch her when she becomes. Now she has already become. So we must watch the process by which somebody becomes a queen. How do you do that? Simple. There's only one queen per colony. Take her away. So you will get a new queen. And now you can watch the process of the birth of a queen. Not birth in terms of being born, but in terms of becoming transformed into a queen. So the experiment was straightforward. We designed a very rigorous experiment where we said on one day for 8, we generally observe these wasps for 8 hours a day. For 8 hours, we will watch a normal colony with all the workers and all the queens, and here watch and observe means what? Determine the time activity budget of every wasp over that day. So we did that for one day, and then early next morning, we experimentally simply removed the queen from the colony, put her in a little bottle, and for next day, for 8 hours, we redetermined the time activity budgets of all the wasps minus the queen. These are sometimes grammatically called orphaned colonies. They don't have a queen anymore. When we did this first time, at the end of the day, we looked at this queen who was sitting in a bottle and said, what do we do with her now? We said, why not put her back? Let's see what happens. We put her back, and to our surprise, she just walked in and started being the queen. Nobody questioned her. She didn't need anything. She just started working. So I said, fine. So on the third day, we recalculated the time activity budgets of all the wasps with the queen returned. So now we have 3 data sets with the queen, without the queen, with the queen returned, and we said, let us look at the behavior of the wasp. In particular, let us look at aggressive behavior, because in other species, the queen is supposed to use aggression. And aggressive behavior in wasps consists of one individual biting, chasing, nibbling, holding somebody in the mouth, various these activities, very mild, they don't cause injury, they are somewhat ritualized, but the individual which chases or holds or harasses, we call it the dominant individual. And the individual which is held or chased or pecked or harassed, we call the subordinate individual. So this class of behaviors is called dominant subordinate behavior, and that is what we especially decided to focus on under these 3 conditions. And a great surprise was to await us. As expected, on day 1, there was very little dominant subordinate interaction. This is a fairly peaceful species. There is some harassment going on, but rather little, almost nothing on day 1, if you measure in quantity. As soon as we removed the queen, all hell broke loose. The rates of dominant subordinate interactions went up in some colonies 2-fold, 3-fold, 10-fold. Our record is 40-fold increase in these interactions as soon as we removed. Even more surprising, all of this new aggression comes from one of the workers. One and only one worker becomes hyper. Put the queen back, goes back to work, stops being aggressive. First day, almost no aggression. Second day, one individual shoots up her aggression. Look at the same individual on day 1. Put the queen back, she's gone back. Wait for another day, she'll come back to the original level. So the answer to question 1 is in Ropalidia marginata, queens begin their careers as very aggressive individuals and only later become weak endocytes. So why are they accepted in the first place? Because at that time they were aggressive. So that seems to be. But this answer will not let you sleep because it raises the question. If that is true, how does she inhibit worker reproduction? I am aggressive only in the beginning. Within a week I am no longer aggressive and I have many more weeks of life. At that time, how do I control my worker? How do I prevent them from becoming queens? Because I am no longer aggressive. So, second question. Now, to answer this question, we have devised a different experiment. Again, we went back to what is known in other species. In other species where the queens are not aggressive, such as honeybees and ants, we know that the queens manage to get away without being aggressive because they produce chemical weapons. They use chemical substances which control the workers. So we said maybe our species, even though she is not morphologically differentiated, even though she belongs to what biologists call a primitive insect society, may have taken this one evolutionary step and actually started producing chemicals that the honeybees and ant queens do. Now in order to study those chemicals, we devised a different experiment, and in this experiment what we did was we put the wasp in a closed cage. On the first day we studied all the wasps and the workers, and on day 2, instead of removing the queens, we removed all the workers and the queens, and then we took a blade and cut the nest in half, 2 equal parts, and inserted a wire mesh screen between these two halves. So that now there are 2 compartments. The purpose of the wire mesh screen is to prevent the wasp from walking across, but allowing chemicals to go across if they are volatile. And after we did this, we picked up each wasp, tossed a coin and said, heads you go to the left side, tails you go to the right side. Next wasp, heads left, tails to the right. Finally they picked the queen, heads you go to the left, tails you go to the right. So we ended up with a situation where the queen plus half the workers on one side of the wire mesh and the remaining half workers on the other side of the mesh, and again we studied them for the whole day. On the third day now, what we did was we took the queen from wherever she was and transferred to the opposite side and didn't disturb the workers. Now the purpose of this rather peculiar design of the experiment is that we can make predictions. And the predictions are as follows. If the queen pheromone, if the chemicals that queens produce to control workers are called pheromones. In fact, any chemical that any animal produces which has an effect on another animal, another individual, is called a pheromone. So if the pheromone is volatile, then it should go through the wire mesh and both sets of workers should realize that they have a live queen. But if the pheromone is non-volatile, then the workers on the queenless fragment should behave as if they don't have a queen. Because these workers will not be able to smell the queen across here because her substance is not volatile, and they should think they don't have a queen, and what should they do? Of course, there should be one hyper-aggressive new worker. Incidentally, I didn't tell you this, but if you return the queen, the aggressive worker will go back to work. What happens if you don't return the queen? If you don't return the queen, in a few days, she will become the next queen. Because that's how she begins her life as an aggressive individual. So we labeled her as the potential queen. A potential queen is defined as one who has now become aggressive, and she stops being a potential queen when she does her first egg. Then she becomes a real queen. So here we expect, if it is non-volatile, a potential queen to emerge. And if that is true, when we move the queen from this side to that side, the potential queen should stop being aggressive, because now the queen has come to our side. But on the opposite side, there should be a new potential queen, because on that side they think, now I don't have a queen anymore. So there are very clear-cut, mutually exclusive predictions, depending on whether the substance is volatile or non-volatile. We did this experiment many times, and every single time, prediction 2 is upheld. That means here, in fact, the workers behave as if they don't have a queen. There is a hyper-aggressive individual, there is a potential queen, and I'll show you what the data look like. Here is day 1, nobody is aggressive. Day 2, only one individual on the queen-less side becomes aggressive. Once I move the queen to her side, she drops her aggression on day 3, and another individual becomes aggressive, who was not aggressive on the previous day because the queen was on her side. And none of them were aggressive on the first day because there was a queen with them. The nest was not cut in half. These data we gather retrospectively. Beforehand, we don't know who the potential queens are going to be. But retrospectively, we pick out this data from the computer and we can plot this graph. So So what seems to happen is that the new queenless side has a potential queen and the previous day's potential queen goes back to work. So the answer is in Ropalidia marginata, queens appear to use non-volatile pheromones to inhibit the workers. That is how the workers recognize whether or not they have. Now, if this is true, it leads to another question, namely, how does she then regulate the non-reproductive activities of workers? In other species which had been studied, especially in North America, as I said, the queen uses aggression both to prevent the workers from becoming queens as well as to make them work. If a worker goes out, does some work, comes back and becomes lazy, the queen will go and bite her. And then she will go and do some more work, and again if she is lazy, she will go and bite her. And in fact, if you remove the queen, they all stop working in other species. So we said if our queen might produce a chemical and through physiology suppress the workers from becoming new queens. But it's hard to imagine that I release a chemical and say go and work. Why should you obey? So there must be some other method by which this meek and docile, non-volatile pheromone producing sitter queen must be making the workers work. So that's another experiment to find out this happens. So now the experiment was very similar. We studied the colonies in great detail with special focus on work. And we chose two examples of work, which we think are the two most important kinds of work that happens in the colony. One is bringing of food from outside. The other is actually feeding it to the young ones. We chose these two examples and we paid special attention to these and we looked at who does how much of these two activities in the presence of the queen, in the absence of the queen, and when the queen is returned, to see whether we can, from this we can try to understand how the queen regulates these behaviors. And to our great surprise, we found that the workers don't care whether they have queen or not. Rates of bringing food, day one with queen, without queen, queen comes back, makes no difference to the workers. The workers do their job, they don't need to be told by the queen. Feeding larvae with queen, without queen, queen return, no statistical difference. So workers do not need to be told by the queen. In fact, the queen does not regulate the non-reproductive active workers, they do it themselves. They seem to know what to do, they don't need the queen to tell them. So our answer really is the queen does not regulate foraging by the workers. And we have subsequently found out that the workers themselves regulate their own foraging in a decentralized, self-organized manner. In fact, that now seems to be our understanding of insect foraging. There is decentralized, self-organized behavior so that patterns just emerge and it is not through a top-down direct control. But this leads to another question. What then is the function of this huge amount of aggression shown by the potential queen? Why does she show that amount of aggression as soon as she removes the queen? And the obvious hypothesis is that at that time she has no pheromone and therefore she must be using it to suppress the workers, temporarily use aggression, which is a kind of primitive mechanism to suppress the workers, and then when you develop your pheromone, then you can become a quiet. That was the obvious hypothesis. Now, when we looked at the actual aggression, we found that the aggression received by an individual seems to be correlated with how much work he does. So the more aggression I receive, the harder I work. Now, here there are two levels here. There is low level of aggression shown in a normal colony by the workers, the so-called 5%. We have to ask what is the function of that. Then there is hyper-aggression shown by the potential queen. Separately, we want to ask what is that. So let's first start with the normal aggression shown by the workers in a normal colony. What is the function of that? If that is not making you into a queen, why show the aggression now? And there we found that there is a correlation between how much aggression an individual receives and how much work she does. So we postulated that the workers' self-organized work tell each other how much to do by actually showing them aggression. So it is not the queen who shows them aggression, but they show to each other. And therefore we did experiments and we said if that is true, then if we give them excess food, if everybody is well fed, there should be no aggression. We don't need to get them to work. So this can be tested experimentally. So my student learned how to feed these wasps. Normally the wasps feed themselves, you leave some food for them there. We grow the larvae, caterpillars of a certain moth species in another room. There's a little factory in our laboratory where we grow hundreds and thousands of caterpillars, and we put them in a dish and the wasps take them. But then they only take what they want. So my student learned how to excess feed them. So she would take a piece of the caterpillar in the forceps and go and sit still near the wasp. And initially the wasps were sort of scared, they would go away. But eventually when this didn't move, they came and grabbed this piece and went away. And then she gave them another. They took it and she gave them another and another and another until they were all completely fed. They actually took this and fed to the larvae, and finally nobody was hungry. Now we ask how much aggression is there. So in such experiments we are actually able to show that excess food reduces dominance behavior. So this is on the day, comparing the 2 days. So bringing food came down because they were not hungry. Feeding the larvae came down because they are already well fed. The dominance behavior came down. In particular, the aggression directed towards food bringers, the foragers, that came down. But that's not enough. We must do the converse experiment. If I starve them, there should be more aggression. That is, of course, it would be easier to starve them. All we did was we closed the doors of the cage and didn't feed them for a day. And there we were able to show that in fact starvation increases this dominance behavior. Okay? So this is now day 1 with the cage open, cage closed, cage open again, and you find that dominance behavior goes up when the cage is closed. Attempts to forage go up, and the proportion of foragers don't change, but of course no food is brought in spite of the attempts. And once you open the cage, then they start bringing food. And once again we were able to show that it is the foragers who were targeted. So when the door was closed, when everybody was hungry, aggression was specifically directed to those who brought food yesterday. And when there was excess food, those who brought food were not targeted. So we believe that this worker dominance behavior in a normal colony is the mechanism by which this decentralized self-organizing by the forager happens. And that brings us to the next question. I won't talk about the hyper-aggression of the workers maybe on another day, but a kind of more burning question from the human point of view. Everybody asks me, how and when is the queen's hair decided? You remove the queen, somebody else becomes the potential queen. And who is this individual? How is this decided? And everybody seems to think that this is a fundamental question of great interest to people. Now, initially people ask this question, and I used to say, I really don't know. It doesn't seem obvious. But the questions persisted, and it was not enough to say it doesn't seem obvious. So we did a few experiments, and the answer was we couldn't care. But the questions persisted. Finally I said we must do something more serious about this, because every time I give a talk, the most important question is who is the next queen? So then I said we must do something very specific, and for a professor doing something very specific means get a PhD student to tackle this problem. So the next PhD student was told, your job is to predict the queen's successor, you got a PhD. The student accepted the challenge, worked very hard for 5 years, lots of experiments, published many papers. At the end, she threw up her hands and said, I cannot predict this. We gave her a PhD, but she could not. What she showed was that the worker who becomes the queen is indistinguishable from others when the queen is present. And within a few days after the queen is removed, she is indistinguishable from the queen. So in fact, she was able to show. So who are these successors? Who are the potential queens? Can we identify the wasp who would be queen? Was the topic of her thesis. And she was able to show that the workers and the potential queens are so similar to each other that you really cannot distinguish. So really the answer is the potential queen is not unique by any criteria, not by her status in the hierarchy of this aggression, not by her behavior, any behavior, not even by the residual amount of ovarian development that she might have. In fact, one with less ovaries than her might become the next queen, and she may lose out. So, answer is one cannot. I might confess that at this stage, I'm not embarrassed. I feel a certain kind of respect for my wasp. There's something that I cannot find out. They know something which I don't know, and I decide to be fact at least for the time. But students are harder to convince. The next student who came to the lab and said, if you can't answer a simple question, ask a tough one. And she said, I want to ask a tougher question. We cannot predict. We don't know who the successor is. I want to know whether the wasp themselves know who their next queen is. Now, Many of us laughed at her and said, this is not a scientifically practical question. How would you know the mind of a wasp? How would you ever be able to tell whether they know who their next is? We spent more than a year thinking of possible experiments to which we might in principle answer this question. We even tried out some of these experiments and we ourselves found flaws in those experiments and said we cannot from this conclude. But finally I believe that we have hit upon an experiment design which will allow us to draw the conclusion. And I will illustrate that. The experiment is very hard to do, but not very hard to describe. It's a rather easy experiment to describe. The strategy we followed is as follows. We see, when you do science, you have to have different ways of doing it. Here we had a different strategy. Here we said, let us make the assumption that everybody, all the wasps know who the next is. Okay? So we basically said, is it possible that there is a hair designate? Even though we cannot identify her, and do the other wasps know who this hair is? So we said, in order to try and answer these questions, we said, let's assume that there is a hair designate, and all of them know who she is. We don't know, but they all know. What would be the consequences of such an assumption? If this were true, what should we expect in response to a certain experiment? That's how science is done. Okay? So we say we make this assumption, then we do an experiment and we predict what we should find in response to this experimental manipulation if in fact this assumption is true. And we use this experimental design where we cut the nest in half and have two parts. And I will, through a simple animation, I will illustrate to you what the experimental design was. So basically we have a cage and we cut the nest in half. We have the queen and half the workers on the other side and the remaining half the workers on the other side. We are now making the assumption that there is a hair designate and that they all know. If that is true, then since we toss a coin and say heads you go left, tails you go right, the wasps are randomly. So there is a probability that the hair designate has ended up on the opposite side of the queen. And if that is true, then there is no problem. Immediately she becomes a potato. Now what we do is we not only move the queen from left to right, but we move the potential queen from right to left. We bring her here. If she is the true hair designate for the whole colony, then they should be acceptable to these wasps also. She should have no problem. She should not be challenged. We move her back to the other side, there will be no problem. She should be acceptable to wasps on the both sides as long as they don't have the original queen. Because she is the true hair designate of both. However, these happy circumstances can happen only in about half the experiment. Because by chance alone, in 50% of the experiment, the hair designate should end up along with the queen, just by chance alone. And now this unfortunate hair designate cannot do it. She's the queen. Only here there can be a potential queen, and that should be one of these wasps who is not the hair designate for the whole colony. She might be the best amongst these, but not the hair designate for the colony. So she becomes a queen. Now, of course, what we do is we bring her here, take the queen there, and bring her face to face with the true hair designate. And now we hoped all hell will break loose. We did that, and we expected that this should be knocked off, and this should become the second aggressive individual we fought her. And now, of course, this is not the end of the story. The acid test for this individual is we move her to the other side, and she should be acceptable to the other side also if she is indeed the true hair designate for the whole. That is the second part of the experiment. So our summary predictions are the first potential queen should be unacceptable to the opposite side in about half the experiment, and a second potential queen should emerge on that side. But the second one should be able to succeed on both sides. There should never be a third contender to the throne. If you cut the nest in two parts, there should be only two contenders, maximum of two contenders. There should never be a third. These predictions can be verified. So they are extremely tedious experiments, partly because the wasps get tired of all the talent you do for them and they sort of give up after a while. But this student, since she had wanted to do this, she spent almost 2 years and was able to repeat this experiment 8 times. And in the 8 times, she was able to show that in 3 out of experiments, no second one emerged in session 2. The first one held her position on both sides. But in 5 of the experiments, potential queen 2 and in 5 of the experiment, a potential queen 2 indeed emerged in session 2, and she held her position both sides. There was never a potential queen number 3 consistent with our prediction. So both these predictions were upheld. Potential queen 2 emerged in half the experiment, no potential queen 3, and all. Now, from a very curious thing happened here. All along, people would ask us, do you know who the potential queen is? Do you know who the success is? And our answer always is, now we proudly said, we know that the Wasp know. And we actually published a paper with the title, we know that the Wasps know. We don't know, but we know that the Wasps know. And therefore we call this cryptic successors to the queen. Now, interestingly, when we do lots of rigorous science, get quantity data, do statistics, we are naturally proud of that. But we must admit that sometimes a simple qualitative observation can tell you more than all the statistics. The real beauty of this experiment is not in the numbers. It is in the observation that it is remarkable that potential queen number 2 was never challenged. She did not receive a single act of aggression by the potential queen 1 or by any of the workers, either when she emerged or when she moved to the other side. That is why we claim that the hair designate was known and acceptable to all the individuals. When the wrong one came, they all knew that you are not the wrong, you are not the right one. So even that didn't have to be told. The potential queen 1 didn't have to be told that it's not your turn anymore. As soon as she saw the potential queen 2, on her own she went back to work. She did not have to be told. That is why we claim that they actually know. So we think that there is a hair designate, even though we cannot identify her in the presence of the queen, and the wasps seem to know who she is. So what you will see in all of this is that there is a great deal of cooperation. In fact, the next student came and said, is there one hair designate, or maybe there is a whole line of them waiting for their turn? And he was able to do experiments show there is indeed a reproductive hue hidden to us, and he was able to show in the presence of the queen, nobody shows aggression. Remove the queen, one and only one individual. Remove her immediately, and another one, but one and only one. Remove her, one and only. So in the course of a day, he was able to go up to potential queen number 5, and he showed that in each case, they all showed aggression, but they were never challenged. Only one individual becomes aggressive, and she is never challenged, suggesting that it all seems to be in some way predetermined. So in fact, there is a long reproductive queue. Now, you might ask, if there is so much peace, it all looks like real peace. Workers don't want the queen to tell them what to do. They don't become queens in the presence of the queen. They know when to work on their own, and they know when they should succeed in the next queen. They don't go stand up out of their turn, etc. Where is the war? Where is the conflict? We, for a long time, we were very keen on seeing conflict. We wanted to see conflict. And it turned out it's very hard to see conflict until you bring two colonies together. Bring members of two colonies together, and you will see all of the conflict. Within a colony, you don't see that. And I'll briefly give you some. So we asked, can the wasp discriminate those who belong to my nest and those who don't belong to my nest? And the answer is yes. So here we designed an experiment where we would put these wasps in a little plastic box. We would put 3 wasps in a box, 2 coming from the same colony and 1 coming from a foreign colony. And we would look at these 3. We would see this 3-way or 6-way interaction, and we designed an index of tolerance, and we found in fact that nestmates tolerated each other, but they did not tolerate non-nestmates. I won't go into the details, but that's what we found. Nestmate discrimination is well developed. War with outsiders is possible. Then we asked, but why is war with insiders not possible? And we were able to show again why. So in Ropalidia marginata, wasps have well-developed mechanism of nestmate discrimination. The wasps are very tolerant of nestmates and highly intolerant of non-nestmates, even in isolation, even under the body. But in another set of experiments, we were asked the question, how do the wasps treat outsiders who come from other colonies if we introduce? So what we did is we took all the members of one colony, introduced it to the cage of that colony, and we found that the response of the residents to the aliens was highly nuanced and variable. In fact, what happened was that when the members were introduced, the young alien workers were admitted freely into the colony, old alien workers were allowed to live in the cage but don't come anywhere near my colony, and the alien queen was attacked and dismembered wherever she was. So they know exactly how to deal with aliens. And we asked whether the wasp can keep track of the introduced wasp once they come into your nest, once they sneak your nest, and we were able to show that they cannot do. Intra-colony discrimination is undeveloped. War with insiders is in fact not possible. They have no mechanism to distinguish who is an outsider once they become insider. And that, I think, is the secret. So there is no evidence of intra-colony discrimination. Young alien workers who are accepted into foreign colonies become completely integrated into their foster colonies and may even go on to become future queens. In fact, we have shown the probability with which an alien will become the next queen is simply proportional to the probability of how many aliens there are. No discrimination. The wasps, therefore, have a great propensity to make war with outsiders and an equally great propensity to maintain peace with insiders. From an evolutionary point of view, war with outsiders is easier to explain than peace with insiders, but war with outsiders is not of much use unless one can combine it with peace with insiders. It is this dual strategy, this ability to tread a fine balance between conflict and cooperation, I believe, that accounts for the success of insect society, so that we even call them super organized. Wow. That's why I think we call them super organized. But let's come back. We humans are the same, aren't we? That's what we try to do. And here I'm very fond of a quotation from a third philosopher, Voltaire, who said, "It is lamentable that to be a good patriot, one must become the enemy of the rest of mankind." Now I want to come back. Why do I study wasps? For the same reason that an anthropologist studies humans. I certainly do not think that we should blindly imitate or copy insects, nature, let alone insects. But I do think that they can hold a mirror to us and offer us a means to reflect on our own society and learn more about ourselves. And that is the thing of studying nature. They hold the mirror and make you understand yourself better. It is not that you want to copy. That's why I use the word wisdom. I do not work with lots of instruments. My research requires very little money. When visitors come to my lab and say, "Where are your sophisticated instruments?" I show the heads of all my students. These are my sophisticated instruments. My research involves sitting with students over tea, coffee, biscuits, samosa, and discussing and talking and doing the experiment. And I thoroughly enjoy doing that. So real credit goes to all my students.